Hi everyone, it's Starbursts, and this is the entirety of my Minecraft building tutorial series, Creative Mode. If you don't already know about the series, I will be explaining the elements and principles of design, such as shape, color, contrast, and the like, and how they can relate to building in Minecraft. Oh, and I'm using the VoxelBox Halcyon texture pack throughout the series, and at specified times I will also use the VoxelBox Organics texture pack. Today, we will cover the two most basic elements, lines and shapes. Lines and shapes are used in every build and can help improve any build. For example, various shapes compose a foundation of a build, and lines are necessary for creating different types of shapes. First, we will review lines, and then take a look at some builds that use them effectively. There are two major varieties of line, static and dynamic. First, there are dynamic or moving lines. This type of line is used mostly in organic or natural builds. The reason for this is because you almost never see perfectly straight or calculated lines in nature. A great example of dynamic lines that seem to move are illustrated in Soul Soda's flower stems at the spawn of the VoxelBox. The flowers look much more natural and almost have a sort of motion to them because of the dynamic quality of the stems. On the other hand, static lines are for the most part straight, but can still have a slight, calculated curvature to them. For example, this dam built by Jomega in Clifton uses a static line at its rim. The line isn't straight, but it's a calculated curve. Such lines that are calculated qualify as static. Connecting lines such as these to enclose a space creates a shape, one use of which is a foundation of a building. Shapes also have two major varieties and also have two subsets. Static shapes are a lot like static lines and seem unmoving. These shapes usually have sharp and defined vertices. Static shapes are mainly used in more realistic builds, like Whalesong Port. You'll notice that Whalesong Port is star-shaped, but also notice that the star is made up of static lines. Static shapes are made with their corresponding variety of lines most of the time. A special quality of static shapes is that they don't seem to move, and therefore give off a sense of strength and impenetrability. A good example of this comes from Razorcane's mansion in Ithia. Because he's trying to build with realism in mind, he uses many static shapes, and so the building seems to have lots of structural integrity. Notice the triangular and quadrilateral cobblestone roof pieces. The definition in the vertices of static shapes also helps convey the sense of strength. Take a closer look at how Razorcane uses static shapes to create the walls of his mansion. A subset of static shapes are geometric shapes. These shapes consist of easily identifiable shapes such as circles, rectangles, and triangles. For the most part, you will want to stay away from using this kind of shape as the main part of your build. Such easily identifiable shapes make a build very easy to figure out, and therefore boring to look at. If you are to use these shapes, make sure that they are not very prevalent throughout your build. Now, just as static lines have their corresponding shape, when dynamic lines connect back around to create an enclosed area, they create either an organic or a dynamic shape. Organic shapes look natural, but don't have to look like they're moving necessarily. The movement of a shape is judged by how you arrange the lines that make that shape. For example, Spectre Cody's shrine at Lake Mistvale uses many organic shapes within it, though it still maintains a static look to it because the building still looks like it can support itself. On the other hand, the dragon back at the Talmor spawn is mostly made up of one enormous dynamic shape. Because it is elongated, it implies movement. We will get to the principle of movement in a later episode, but one way to illustrate movement is with organic lines and elongated shapes. The fact that the build is a dragon also helps convey the fact that it's most likely flying. All the things that I said about shape can also apply to forms, which are just 3D shapes. Some perfect examples of dynamic form come from the boat that Double Numb and Sonus made. The sails on the boat are very organic and look like they are being blown by the wind. Static form should be much more self-explanatory, seeing as most buildings in Minecraft are static and three-dimensional. The use of different varieties of lines and shapes can convey different information in each build. Things are boring without color, so today we will learn about how colors go together and create an impression on spectators with the use of a color wheel. But to fully understand color, we first need to learn about value. Value is the representation of how much light there is in a block. This should not be confused with the in-game lighting engine. The value of a block depends on the amount of white or black that the block has in it, and therefore, it also depends on the amount of light that it can reflect. We'll start with some monochromatic blocks, like obsidian and white marble. Something that is perfectly black has no light reflecting off of it. A white block, such as marble, is white because all colors of light reflect off of it. There's also a middle ground between perfectly black and perfectly white, and we call these colors grays. There are many blocks in the Halcyon texture pack that belong in this middle ground. Most of them are stone-type blocks. All of the values of black and white match, and so making builds with them are very easy. Monochromatic builds are fun and all, but to really add some life to your build, you need actual colors. So I introduce to you our dear friend, the color wheel. There are 12 colors in the color wheel which represent the spectrum of colors that we see. If you take a look at any segment, the surrounding colors will slowly evolve into different colors until you get back to where you started. Also, there are blocks in Minecraft that represent each of the sections of the color wheel. Some blocks don't quite match any colors though, and this is because they are neutralized. We'll get to neutralization in a second though, but let's first take a quick look at the Organics texture pack and study some color value and color harmony while we're at it. Many of the blocks in the Organics texture pack are dedicated to represent only colors rather than textures. Its creator, Kupo, did this for a variety of reasons, but she incorporated all of the colors of the color wheel in the pack. So let's do a quick study of basic color theory. We have our three primary colors, red, yellow, and blue. Mixing those in different ways grants you with orange, green, and purple. We call these secondary colors. Mixing these with other primary and secondary colors in various ways gets you the tertiary colors. So these are the 12 colors of our wheel, and there are different ways in which these can be matched. Let's take a look at complementary colors. If you take two colors that are on opposite sides of each other on the color wheel, you will get complementary colors. Most people like the way these colors look together. When you mix two complementary colors together, they tend to become browner or grayer, or they become neutral. Neutral colors are the opposite of bright and bold, but they can still add more life to your build than gray values can, and they can do it without overwhelming your senses like bright and bold colors would do. Let's add all of our neutral colors to the color wheel and see what we get. You'll see that most of the woods are red and oranges, while most of the metals are blue, and everything else is somewhere in between. Even though these colors are neutralized, they work together just the same as bold and bright colors do. Now, back to the Organics texture pack. We also have different values of colors, just like we have different values of black and white. These colors with value appear darker or lighter than their base, which is shown on the color wheel. Examples are things like dark purple and sky blue. Both are purples and blues, respectively, but they just appear darker and lighter than their base. Valued colors will work just the same way as their non-valued counterparts. Just be aware that using darker colors more will make your build look gloomy, and brighter colors will have the opposite effect. Sometimes having a good balance of both can work really well. Take Dream RX's house for example. The build uses a few light and dark values, but it also incorporates lots of mid-ranged values. You'll also notice that it uses complementary colors in the form of neutralized green and red. The red comes from the wood portions of the build, and the green comes from the stone that he used. There's also something called split complementary colors, in which you take one color and take the two colors that are adjacent to its complement. An example of split complementary colors would be this pillar I made. It has blue, reddish-orange, and yellow-orange. I used the reddish-orange and the blue as highlights because of their bold coloring. This keeps them balanced. You will also almost never want to use only big, bright, and bold colors in your build. It's best to have mostly neutral colors, but draw attention to various spots of your build with brighter colors. There are also analogous colors, which are just colors that appear next to each other on the color wheel. Technically, you could take all 12 colors of the color wheel and call them analogous, but building with 12 different colored blocks would make a build look very busy. Instead, 4 or 5 colors should suffice if you also blend in some gray valued blocks. A good example of this is the village of Kaldekar. It uses red in the wood, purplish red, purple, and purplish blue for the roofs. Now, different types of colors make people feel differently about builds. There are warm and cold colors. Warm colors are usually reds, yellows, and oranges, and they give off the feeling of warmth. Take a look at this kitchen. Because of the spacing of the pieces of furniture and the colors that I used to make it, it has a warm and cozy feeling to it. There are also cold colors, which are mainly blues. We relate these colors to cold water and ice, just like the kind that is present on the mountains of Skull. Blacks, whites, and grays are influenced by the colors that surround them. White next to a warm color will look warmer, and white next to a cold color will look cold. Lots of times, whites tend to go better with cold colors though, because we think of snow when we see white. Black tends to be better with warm colors because we think of burnt things such as charcoal when we see black. And that's a basic explanation of color and color harmony. This is the element of space. Learning how Minecraft goes about rendering its 3D environment is important, but it's even more useful to know how to manipulate it to give your build a certain effect. To fully understand how we can use space to our advantage, it's good to first learn how Minecraft creates the illusion of space on what's really just a flat screen. Firstly, as things go farther off into the distance, their color seems to fade and become a lighter value. Minecraft already does this with a view fog. We're going to take a look at the town of Elvir by Aurore, and the adjacent mountains, which were terraformed by Gnarlas. You'll notice that from the village's point of view, the mountains are just at the edge of where the fog begins. This means that the colors on the mountains are less intense, and that the mountains therefore seem to go further off into the distance. Scale is the second way that depth can be made. As things go further off into the distance, they also become smaller. The buildings and the layout of the town are rather small and intricate, but just off in the distance there are some comparatively large mountains. Even though the mountains are not actually much taller than the tallest building in the town, the view distance fog makes them seem as if they're further away. Because you believe that the mountains are far away, you would also think they would appear to be smaller than normal, but the mountains are actually a regular size, which makes them seem especially large and tall. We're now going to learn about the main way Minecraft creates 3 dimensions on a flat surface using something called linear perspective. Everyone can draw a simple cube on a piece of paper, but this doesn't look like a very realistic cube that we see in Minecraft. You'll notice that all of the lines on one face of the cube are parallel to its opposite side. We don't often see this effect in game. Instead, Minecraft uses what's called linear perspective to render its environment. Linear perspective has 3 main components: the horizon line, vanishing points, and your head height, which will adjust the horizon line's value on the y-axis. In real life, the horizon line occurs when you look off into the distance so far that the Earth begins to curve back around. Because of this, your line of sight just goes straight off into space. This is why the sky always looks like a backdrop when you look out over an ocean. In Minecraft, the horizon line occurs right around where your chunks stop loading when your view distance is unfar. Some multiplayer servers limit the amount of chunks you can load, so you may not be able to always see your accurate horizon. Alright, so let's draw a horizon line on this piece of paper for the sake of an example. It's just a simple line right across the page. Now we can still draw our derpy cube from before on here, but it will look just as odd. So instead of just drawing it randomly, linear perspective uses vanishing points. If you look at a picture of a long railroad track, it seems to thin out and disappear as it goes into the distance. This is due to linear perspective. Let's draw a simplified example. Let's say the 2 lines represent a road. You see that along the horizon line I placed 1 dot, which represents our vanishing point. All the lines that go off towards the horizon meet at this point. Let's draw a simple sign now. You see that I draw all the lines necessary to make it, but then erase the parts that I don't want. This ensures that the lines of my sign stay consistent with my linear perspective. With 1 vanishing point, we only had 1 dimension that could represent depth. If we add another vanishing point, then both the Z and X axis can represent depth. So here we draw the edge of our cube and basically just connect the dots, erase a little bit, and then finish the cube off. You'll notice that this example looks a little more like Minecraft. Now, back to the mountains. You'll also notice that the mountains scale down in terms of their width very well in respect to the village. If we were to draw out lines of perspective according to a watchtower in front of the town, you'll see that these lines more or less encompass the width of the mountain range. In this picture, our vanishing points are at the end of where the chunks render. This is clearly demonstrated on the left side of the picture. But on the right side of the mountain, our vanishing point is off screen. Our third perspective line will more or less go straight up into the air, but if we are to draw another line which vanishes at the point to the right side, you'll see that it too encompasses a portion of the mountain, its height. Not only can the element of scale help you while terraforming, it also plays a key role in Poppingway Grove, a project led by Kupo. Like most organic builds, Poppingway Grove is built on a macro scale, as if you were an ant compared to the large and silly figures that are scattered about. Building in large scale enables organic builders to add more details to their builds, which really helps bring them to life. Space can also be used effectively on the interior of a build. Let's check out the Mechanicsburg Mall, built by Stuart Tillier in the VoxelBox Modern Texture Pack. Its interior space illustrates how a large and open area can make a build seem much more grandiose, although as a result, less cozy. The interior space of the mall consists of one large room, which is separated into 3 tiers where shoppers can walk by stores that are located in the smaller rooms. The resulting effect of this vast space are awestruckenness and amazement, and they were all intended when the build was designed in order to emphasize the impressive scale of it. Another member of the VoxelBox, Luna Omi, built an interior space with just the opposite effects. She furnished her apartment in one of the skyscrapers of Protel to make it seem more cozy and homely. She used very tight spaces in her interior. You'll see this especially clearly in the floor plan. There's almost never more than a few blocks of space to walk through, but this crowdedness, compounded with the warm wooden tones of the walls and floors, makes the apartment seem just that much more comforting compared to the Mechanicsburg Mall. Even though these two builds utilize opposite interior spaces, each build is successful in its own way, and for its own reasons. Stuart Tillier was never trying to make his mall seem like a cozy place to live, nor was Luna trying to make her single-story apartment seem as if it were an extremely impressive shopping center. No one technique is better than the other. It all depends on the context and application of it. And lastly, I'd like to mention an attribute that can greatly increase the appeal of your interior space. Most interiors in Minecraft, even some of the higher quality ones here on the VoxelBox, have floors that are flat and relatively planar. Great interiors, on the other hand, tend to utilize the third dimension of space, the y-axis, in their floor plans. For example, let's take a look at the interior of Brent's house. As we move around it, we find that there are variations in the height of the floor plan. Such a floor plan enables a viewer to have their point of view constantly changing in a way that they're not used to. Again, most of the time your point of view is just moving along the X and Z axis in Minecraft, although taking advantage of height in your interior can make for a much more engaging and interesting product. And these were some helpful uses of space that can hopefully aid you in your creative building experience from now on. This last element on our list is texture. The uses of texture in Minecraft may seem rather self-evident at a glance, in that each block has a different texture on it, but we can go much deeper than this. We should not think of textures existing only on singular blocks. Instead, we should think of texture as the surface quality of any given object. Objects ranging from the ground to foliage to your actual build. Of course, none of these mentioned objects can be built with one singular block. You'll see that throughout this video, multiple block types are used to achieve a certain surface quality. But let's look at what actually creates textures in the first place. All of the textures in Minecraft are what we call implied textures. Implied textures give their sense of surface quality by imitating what we know as textures in real life, and ones that we have experienced in the real world. Let's take a look at some real-world textures and compare them to their Minecraft equivalent. What we see when we examine the spark texture is that lots of ridges are created along the length of the tree. Even though they're on a flat screen for you, we can still see some depth going on here. That's because different textures are made by how an artist chooses to differ the value from one area to another. We see this bark as a rough texture for 2 reasons. We have a stark contrast between the black-colored ridges and the highlights of the bark, and in addition to this, many of us have already felt such a texture in our own real lives. So with this knowledge, we can create textures to have in Minecraft, such as this log texture. Although the log texture in the Halcyon texture pack is a bit smoother, we can still see darker ridges in contrast with the highlights of the block. Now what I was getting at before is how we can apply the same concept of value to a larger area of multiple blocks. In cases such as these, we would use individual blocks to represent their values or components of the environment. Using textures within your environment can easily help you improve the quality of a build without even having to touch the build itself. I'm going to use the town of Lisau, built by Muppled and Kesaru, as an example of environmental textures. The build consists of a mangrove forest area which is split into small islands. Using only grass would not have worked nearly as well as incorporating the various textures that are currently on the ground. If we take a closer look, we can see all of the elements of the swampy mangrove forest. Mud, dirt, sand, grass, and goop are spread all across the landscape. When we view the landscape though, we don't see these blocks as individual elements, but instead as a collectively established texture on the ground. In this case, we know that the ground is kind of muddy and sandy with a little vegetation. In addition to the ground, the pair of builders chose to incorporate a unique kind of mangrove tree, which is made of fences, leaves, logs, and metal pipes, which are used to represent dead leaves which are hanging downwards. The mixture of these blocks gives the tree a very unique texture, and it adds another element to the environment which makes it have a greater sense of depth and realism. Another area that utilized environmental elements on top of textured ground is this war zone, made mostly by Ryan M16. You'll notice that in areas where the fighting has occurred, or where the ground is commonly walked upon, there is less grass. It has instead been replaced by mud, dirt, and rock. This is an interesting element to the environment because although we cannot see the fighting in the area, we know where they fought, and we can even see the remains of the battle equipment scattered across the landscape. The pieces of equipment do the same thing for this war zone that the mangrove trees do for Lisao. They provide a greater sense of environmental detail and add a better sense of depth and realism to the area. Textures don't only have to be used in the environment around a build, they can also be incorporated directly into one. A great and very original use of texture was made by Howlize in his town of Fall Reaver in Trinith. Howlize used fully grown wheat on top of his buildings. The texture of wheat more accurately depicts individual stalks of grass. These stalks are what thatched roofs are usually made out of in real life as well, and are more realistic looking than other, more orthodox alternatives due to their texture. Another town that uses textures heavily in its environment and its buildings is the small resource harvesting colony of Salem, built by Yville and Andy BZ17. The disorganization and sloppiness of the Salem buildings and environment match the way the people of Salem and its parent city, Bedlam, conduct themselves in the lore of the home region, Misk. Salem is a colony of the very quickly growing and resource-consuming Bedlam. Thus, Salem's goal is to harvest as many resources as possible with no regard whatsoever for the byproducts of their efforts or their implications for the surrounding environment. The sloppiness of the build style in Salem reflects the people's values of building things quickly, hogging all the resources, and not caring much about what they leave behind. This sloppiness is reflected in the textures in the form of disrepaired segments of builds or improperly built elements. In addition to this, the builds often use multiple blocks to depict a single surface. This creates a sense of disorganization in that the builders of the town worked so quickly and sloppily that they did not even bother to find the correct blocks to finish the builds. Instead, they just used what was easiest to find and most readily available. The surrounding terrain has also been very well polluted by the conduct of Salem, which again reflects their conduct in the lore of the region. And this, I think, is where good builds become great builds. The surrounding environment and landscape of a build is just as important as the build itself. If surroundings don't match, then the build will never be as great as it could be. Texture plays a huge role in this matching of the environment to the build, as very well demonstrated in Salem. The buildings produce dirty pollutants and look as such. Plus, the environment looks like it has been polluted as well. But I believe that the ultimate blending of environment and builds exists in the swamp town of Trinith, built by the Apple Machine and Gnarlas. What makes this place so great is how it can so perfectly combine textures and colors of the environment and place them into builds. We see that the ground of the swamp is muddy and marshy, as shown by the water, grasses, and muds that are scattered about. Trees with very warmly colored leaves are also placed around the swamp area. But here's where the environment connects to the build. The very same leaves overrun the unmaintained and abandoned castle in the center of the swamp. The same wood that the trees are made of is incorporated into the castle as well. Muck that was originally on the ground has found its way up the walls of the former fortress, and what was originally the strong stone brick now crumbles into cobblestone and gravel. Even the paths and bridges are in disrepair and are covered with elements of the swamp. In essence, the drab conditions of the swamp match the decrepit castle which sits in the middle, and texture plays a huge role in this. My personal favorite use consists of the once brick walls. Portions of the wall have crumbled into smaller pieces, and that some have even crumbled further than that. We also see the same elements of disrepair that we saw in Salem. On the walkways alongside the walls of the castle, we see more of a literal texture with indentations in certain areas, which signifies their state of disrepair. And these are just a few examples of how texture was used in this swamp area. I'm sure that many other instances can be found if you review the video. What is most important to take away from this video is that the environment and build that you create in it need to fit for one another, or else your build will never be as good as it could. A major element in connecting these two is texture, as demonstrated in both Salem and the swamp area. Also important to remember is what you're trying to create by using different blocks. Especially when it comes to terrain, you can't think of the blocks as individual entities, but instead think of what each type of block will add to the environment. Now that the first half of the Creative Mode series, which focused on the elements of visual design, is over, I thought I might as well make a short introductory video on the principles of visual design. So we've already seen a few videos covering the elements of visual design, which we now know to consist of line, shape, form, value, color, space, and texture. The elements of design describe the different components of any piece of artwork, whether it be real or Minecraft. What's different about the principles is that instead of describing specific components of design, they describe how the components work together to create a successful piece. Thus, the elements create the principles. These principles will be the topic of the next 6 episodes of Creative Mode, the last of which will air at the end of June and will mark the end of the series. But let's use a quick example of contrast to examine how elements can work together to create principles. If I were to put black next to white, then we're using the principle of contrast by creating it with the element of value. I can also put a rough texture next to a smooth texture, and now we have contrast created through the element of texture. Remember, elements work together to create principles. Balance describes how well the visual weight of a build can be focused in one area over another. Visual weight can be described as where in the build your eye is drawn most heavily. Universally, your eye will be drawn to said point due to an element of visual design that is employed in the build. Visually balanced builds will have no preference in any area. To illustrate visual weight, we can look at this small design that I made. You'll notice that due to my use of the element of color, your eye is drawn to the right side of the picture on a more frequent basis than it is on the left side. We can make the same sort of imbalance with the element of texture, and so on. The greatest takeaway from this example is that the elements work together to create the principles. Now let's move on to the different kinds of balance that we can employ in our builds. The most simplistic and commonly used form of balance is symmetrical balance. This is not to say that we shouldn't use symmetrical balance in our builds. Just because lots of people use it doesn't mean you can't use it as well, especially if we do it through a unique use of the elements. A successful use of symmetrical balance comes from the member Evider Baker, who built the ancient Temple of Ankara. When viewed from the front, the main structure clearly uses symmetrical balance through the use of form, line, and color. But let's go a bit further and analyze how he uses these elements to create balance in his build. The element of form is used in the general structure of the building. No matter what side you view, the opposite side will look identical. This creates symmetry through form, and results in balance through form as well. The element of color is used similarly to the element of form, in that areas are colored symmetrically. Again, any color you can view on one side also exists on the other side of the build. And in the same way that form creates balance through symmetry, color also creates balance. But the elements of line play a little bit of a different role while still achieving the same effect. In the main structure of the build, we can almost see layers of differently colored blocks that stack on top of one another to create the tower that we see. This sort of layering is not only another identical element that adds to the symmetry, but flat lines created by layers also add a sort of evenness and steady feeling to the build. These two factors also contribute to the balance of the build, as the flat lines create no preference for one area of the build over another. Another less commonly used type of balance is approximate or asymmetrical balance. This type of balance occurs when a composition still retains the quality of equally distributed visual weight while not being symmetrical. One of our fastest builders, Spectre Cody, created the Temple of Vasir in Tanvir. While building it, he kept the principle of balance in mind, but also tried to keep the build itself asymmetrical. He accomplished his goal by creating asymmetrical balance mostly through the use of form and space. The main elements of the build that carry visual weight are the three towers, the central structure, and the background object. These 5 components work together by using form and space to create a balanced build, and here's how. Let's first split the build in half and see what each side brings in terms of its visual weight. We see that there's one large tower in the foreground, which is not really that tall compared to the other towers in the background, but due to the perspective, it seems as such anyway. Further back and just to the right, we have the taller of the 2 towers, which also helps to add weight to the left side of the build. At first, it may seem that the left side of the build is unbalanced because its components are taller, but this is not the case. Despite the shorter appearance, the right side also carries an equal amount of visual weight. If we ignore the tower in the foreground on the left, we see that the right side of the build is actually wider than the left. Here, the right side consists of the right, yet shorter tower, and the objects that fall into the background to fill the space between the lesser tower and the greater tower in the center. So despite it being shorter, we can still say they have equal visual weight. But let's go ahead and add back the tower in the foreground. What is there to balance that out? Well, take a look at the way that the staircase slants. It creates a diagonal line going from bottom right to top left. Thus, the structure and the staircase itself take up more space on the right side, and even out the weight of the tower on the left side in the foreground. Clearly, much more thought has to be put into asymmetrical balance, but the product that you get from it are oftentimes better. There's also one other type of balance called radial balance, and it occurs when elements of the build create a sort of pattern that radiates from a central point. This sort of balance is used perfectly in the Plaza of Nefret Mizir, built by Gigi. We see the elements of shape and line creating a radial pattern around the center of the plaza where each quarter of the plaza is symmetrical. We can see lines and shapes that sort of point outwards and away from the center, but we never see shapes that contradict them. Oftentimes, this sort of balance can be incorporated into smaller components of a build. For example, many people tend to put emblems on the facades of their buildings that incorporate radial balance. Also, this sort of balance doesn't necessarily have to incorporate symmetry, although it often does. You'll notice that throughout this video, I've been explaining how to achieve balance in your build through different means and how great each build is for incorporating the principle in its own way. Do not let this make you think that you must have a balanced build to have a good build. It's simply not possible to incorporate all of the principles of design into any single build. You must pick and choose the ones you use in order to give your build the desired feeling, and it all depends on context. For example, some of the most unique builds on the server have been contributed by a newer member, Roanos. He has done several builds for various regions on the VoxelBox, and rarely do his builds incorporate balance. He created a town in the middle of the sea called Fair-Shallow in the region of Thysis. If his builds had looked in pristine condition while they were stranded in the middle of the ocean, the town would not have given off the right impression. Of course, the salt water that the buildings are surrounded by have rotted the wood, so the buildings look like they sag or are in disrepair, and as a result, are imbalanced. Of course, this imbalance doesn't detract from the build whatsoever. In fact, it adds to them because of their context. The lesson that we should draw from this is that a good build does not necessarily have to incorporate the principle of balance. Again, it all depends on the context and the sort of feeling that you want to convey with your build. Unity describes the sense of togetherness that a build has, and can usually be achieved by equal distribution of the elements throughout the composition. Let's contrast two examples of an ununified build with the unified one. You'll see that in the unified build, we can't easily place any lines where we would cut the build into pieces. On the ununified build, we are able to do this. We can easily identify different portions of the build as split up based on color variation and distribution. The only use of this dull gray block is concentrated in the top layer of the ship's hull, and thus stands out from the rest of the build as if it were its own component. Thus, from the color contrast, we can draw a separation. If we go back to a unified build, we can once more see how we cannot draw this definitive line as we did with the ununified build. Of course, there are many ways that a builder can achieve the quality of unity in their builds. As said before, unity can be achieved through equal distribution of various elements. The most effective are color and texture. So let's take a look at some good uses of unity through those two elements. Hythus CG built a town on the side of a mountain in the region of Thysis, and the mountains that he terraformed look great because they are unified through texture. If we take the palette that he used in his terrain, we see that all the textures are very similar, or at least have very similar parts. Because of this, the mountain can have color variation to add some interest, yet it can still retain its sense of unity through similar textures. Now let's travel back to Ankara, which we saw in the previous episode of Creative Mode on balance. Not only are the main temple structures of Ankara balanced, but the entire build is unified through color. As we went over in the last episode, the equal distribution of colors in Ankara helped to create a balanced build. The colors also helped to create unity in the same way. We can notice equal distribution of colors throughout all the structures in Ankara. But Ankara also creates unity through a different method, through the use of dominant and subordinate structures. We can see there are a few but much larger towers in the main temple grounds of Ankara, and these larger structures help to set the standard of unity for the rest of the smaller or subordinate structures that are everywhere else. The larger structures also help to attract the viewer's attention away from the shorter builds, which helps them to set the standard of unity in the composition. In short, everything in this area sort of matches in terms of their color, and they work to preserve the sense of oneness, or unity, for the build. Unity may also be achieved through repetition of similar visual components, such as demonstrated here in Adonia. The builds are somewhat different looking, but overall they are very similar in terms of their design, especially with respect to color. When placed into an environment, they all look quite similar and unified as one town rather than a few different builds. But unity doesn't have to be used in order to create a good build. Oftentimes, boats, such as this one made by Animatia, use differently colored layers in their hulls and therefore are ununified. Of course, this build contains other aesthetically pleasing properties that make it look nice, but we're going to get to those in another video. And that's all there really is to Unity. Just remember that it gives the build a sense of togetherness through an equal distribution of the elements throughout the composition. Contrast describes the degree of difference between uses of any element. For example, we can create a very contrastic composition through using value when we put a black block on a white background, and vice versa. We can also create contrasting colors by doing the same thing with complementary colors. Contrast can be used for a variety of purposes. The three most common uses of contrast are to add visual interest, draw a viewer's focus to certain points in the composition, or set an overall mood for the build. Almost universally, contrast is used in some form to add interest to a build. Simply by using different blocks, a builder is using some form of contrast. Some great examples of commonly used contrast methods are employed by the two builders Yville and AndyBZ17 in their town, Bedlam. We can easily see the differently colored, valued, and textured blocks that are used in their palettes to create contrast and add interest to their builds. If we look closer, we can break down exactly how they achieved this. When looking at any build in Bedlam, and in fact most good builds here on the VoxelBox, we find that there are two components to the walls. There are blocks that are used for trim and blocks that are used for walls. A build's trim blocks tend to resemble the general structure of the build, while main wall blocks fill in the remaining gaps. Also, trim tends to encompass these regular wall colors and contrast with them in terms of their color, texture, value, or really any other element, and even some principles. As a result, the combination of trim blocks and main wall blocks tends to make the build more interesting to look at. Contrast may also be used to draw interest to certain areas of a build to create the principle of emphasis. We'll go further into the principle of emphasis in another video, but in this way, contrast acts more like an element. This boat, built by Alexander, uses contrast in just such a way. The intensity of the colors that are used in the ship are much greater on the top of the ship's deck, and because of this, a viewer's eye is drawn to that area more frequently. Thus, through the use of contrasting colors, he created the principle of emphasis. But most importantly, contrast can be used to set an overall mood for a build. Heavily contrasting elements tend to create a gloomy or ominous atmosphere, while less contrast tends to create a light, easygoing, or pristine environment. An example of a more gloomy environment comes from the dilapidated remains of Mistvale, built by Naralas. Contrasting values and colors play a key role in the emphasis of the town's condition. The town is in ruin, so it should give off a darker vibe. It achieves this through the large contrast in value and color. In the palette of the build, we see only gray blocks, but the differences in the values is very great. A stark contrast of dark and light values tends to create a gloomy environment, and this concept is illustrated perfectly along Lake Mistvale. In addition to this, contrasting of pure values and actual colors tends to give off the same foreboding appearance. The opposite effect is achieved in the city of Ionius, built by the guy who can fly. Instead of using very contrasty elements, he instead incorporated lighter valued blocks and chose not to incorporate largely contrasting elements as central components of his builds. This effect is especially prevalent in the palace area of the build. As said before, the lack of contrast creates a more pristine and complacent looking area. Now keep in mind that other elements besides color, value, and texture can contrast, but those three are some of the most evident and thus the most important. But that's all there is for a basic understanding of contrast. Just remember that it describes the degree of difference between elements and can be used to add visual interest, draw a viewer's focus to certain points in the composition, or to set an overall mood for the build. This time, we'll be reviewing the principle of emphasis. Emphasis describes how a component of the build stands out from the rest by drawing your eye towards it. This is due to a variety of factors that we'll review in this video. In the past episode on contrast, we established the notion of contrasting elements in this boat made by Alexander. What we did not say is that the large contrast of color between the bottom of the boat and the top creates the principle of emphasis. Because of how richly colored the top of the boat is, the eye tends to be drawn to that location more often than it is drawn to the hull or other parts that have duller colors. Another example of emphasis through color contrast comes from the town of Vitrena, built by Cranium. Because it's built in the desert, it would be most appropriate to make the houses out of sand-type blocks, as sand and sandstone would be the most widely available resources in the desert. But, if the buildings had only been built out of sand-colored blocks, it would be very hard to distinguish the builds themselves from the terrain. So, to emphasize the presence of the builds, Cranium decided to incorporate some richly colored wool to contrast with the surroundings and emphasize the builds. Scale may also be used to emphasize certain aspects of a build or the entirety of a build. In the Raider's Shelf, built by Wyville, he uses large landscape structures to create emphasis on that feature of his town. Oftentimes, towns are built around a central structure that we often refer to as the feature build. The feature build tends to showcase the general style of the town and is usually set apart and emphasized from the rest of the town due to some artistic element. In the case of the Raider's Shelf, the landscape is the feature build, and it is set apart and emphasized from the rest of the town due to its scale. Scale is commonly used to emphasize feature builds, but placement within the context of the town can also play a key role. In the town of Brynshire, built by Dedumples, DreamRx, and Hytha CG, the feature build is the main castle on the hill. Not only is it separated by its size relative to the average build in the town, but it is also a different color, and it's placed on a high point in the town. The fact that the castle is on a hill rather than mingling with the lesser builds also sets it apart, and we call this concept placement. The appropriate placement of a castle with respect to the town helps to emphasize its significance. And those are just a few ways that you can incorporate the principle of emphasis into your build. Patterns are created when a component of the build is repeated in such a way that the next iteration of the repetition can be somewhat predictable. There are several types of patterns that commonly appear in Minecraft, all of which can aid you in your building process. The easiest type of pattern to employ in your build is also the most simplistic. The The repetition of any subordinate visual component in the build will create a pattern. For example, we can take a look at the exterior of the Runway Theater built by Kupo Kupo. You can see that portions of her walls are entirely composed of a single subordinate component that repeats along the length of the wall. Another type of pattern which is quite easy to execute is a grid pattern. Obviously, Minecraft is just one large grid, so creating a pattern out of it is pretty easy. Just look at the example provided by the Mechanicsburg Mall, built by Stuart Tillier. He often uses grid patterns with very linear and geometric shapes to construct the outer walls of his mall to give it a more modern design. Another way to create a pattern is through a simple layout of approximately equally spaced rows. We often see this kind of row pattern in crop fields, such as these ones built by Kesaru and RCT3 Shadow. And lastly, there are radial patterns, such as the kind that Gigi often creates in Tanvir. You'll notice that the pattern sort of radiates from a central point, similarly to a composition that has radial balance. Yet the definition of a radial pattern is different, in that the pattern itself radiates from the center, but is also consistent as it goes around the central point. Rather than the pattern repeating in a more linear fashion like the crops, the pattern instead wraps around a central point. Movement describes how a builder is able to create an implied motion out of a still object. One of the most universal uses of movement appears in the concept of material grain. The concept of material grain was first documented in late 2010 by Featherblade on the Voxel Wiki. He taught that the texture of certain blocks implied different kinds of motion. For example, the marble pillar block in the Halcyon texture pack has better continuity when stacked on top of itself than when it's stacked side by side. This is because the block displays a sort of vertical movement because the lines in the texture go in a vertical direction. This means that this type of block will have a preference for being placed on top of one another. There are also blocks that have horizontal movement, such as logs when placed sideways. These blocks will have a preference for being placed side by side. And then, lastly, many blocks display a sort of neutral movement and imply no motion with their texture, and they have no preference for their placement. Understanding the principle of movement when applied in this manner is fundamental to building well and has been for a very long time now. We can even see these concepts demonstrated in the oldest builds on the VoxelBox here in the earlier parts of Addenberry, built by Andy BZ17. And we also see the exact same fundamental concept employed in all of the newer towns on the server, such as Hanai, built by Spectre Cody. If you need even more references, check out all of my previous videos. In all of the builds that were showcased, this principle still applies. Now, movement can also be used to help bring a scene in Minecraft to life through the use of dynamic elements. Dynamic elements in a build are components that seem like they're in motion. Again, we can't have actual motion in Minecraft, but we can make builds look like they're actually in motion based off the type of build it is or the build's position in space. Let's take a look at Bedlam. The town incorporates many small and dynamic builds which add life to the chaos and disorderliness of the city. There are many blimps that float above the city, and they seem like they're in motion for a variety of reasons. Firstly, we understand that the majority of the time, blimps that are in flight will be moving. With that common knowledge in mind, combined with the fact that in many instances the engines project smoke from the blimps, we again come to understand that the blimps are moving. But what really helps them come to life is their off-axis build style. Most of the time, the lines that are used in Minecraft to build are constructed along only the X or Z axis. But builds really come alive when lines that are used in the build defy this concept and are built across both axes. This is exactly what happens with some of the blimps that are floating around Bedlam, and it gives off the impression that they are truly independent of the classical Minecraft straightness and can move freely about the world. Lastly, we can introduce another type of movement that can be used very effectively to emphasize certain parts of a build by controlling where the player looks and moves. This is called compositional movement, and it describes how the viewer's eye will move about the build. Let's take a look at this floating city built by Spectre Cody right outside of his city of Hanai. The dark green lines that span across the hull horizontally really contrast with the surrounding materials, and therefore catch the viewer's eye quickly. The viewer will then follow those lines down the length of the ship. This could have been done for a variety of reasons. Maybe Cody wanted to emphasize the length of the ship. Whatever the reason, Cody controlled where you looked by using the elements and principles in his build. Oftentimes in feature builds, builders may consider incorporating compositional movement to guide a player to the entrance of a building. Compositional movement also applies to the interior of buildings, but in a very different way. In fact, I made a full video of it on my own YouTube channel, and the link is in the description. And that's all there is to movement as it pertains to Minecraft. I just want to thank everyone for their support over the course of the series. From the builders whose builds I often use, to the regular viewers of the show who enjoy and learn from what I create, all the way to Alex and Chibi, who have always really believed strongly in the series. I do truly hope that you've enjoyed the entirety of the show. And as always, I would like to thank you one last time for watching, and I hope you've enjoyed.